Welcome to the Liverpool Salon, and it's great to see so many people here. I'm Pauline Hadaway. I'm one of the founders and one of the conveners of the Liverpool Salon, and we're delighted again. This is the second Saturday salon where we've held it here in this beautiful building, the Athenaeum, and invited people to come along on a Saturday to enjoy some serious discussion, but in a very, very convivial atmosphere, as we'll find out later, if those of us who want to join us in the newsroom to continue the conversation. This Liverpool Salon is all about housing, and it started off really as a, we wanted to talk about the housing crisis, and that means really the failure, I suppose, of successive governments to build or to create the conditions where houses can be built, rents can be affordable, and the next generation can afford to actually buy a house or rent a house and bring up a family and live their lives successfully. So it's such an important thing. And our question really was, why can't Britain build houses? And immediately that question, I think, for me, raises the question, well, we did. We used to do it, and we live in Liverpool. We're surrounded by houses that were built after the First World War, after the Second World War, in between the wars. Britain used to be able to build houses. Why can't we build them now? Is it money? Do we not have enough resources? Or is there something more fundamental? Have we stopped believing that we're capable of planning and building and making a future collectively as a country, as a nation? So we decided to take a historical perspective on this question and to start by looking back at what were the successes and the failures, if you like, of what many regard as the golden age of planning and house building. And we have three, and I'll explain that in a moment, very, very informed and competent and interesting speakers who are going to give us their take on this. We've only got two at the table. One of them has sent us his presentation, which we're going to play. But he's indisposed. He had a minor back problem and he can't travel, so he's going to be here in spirit, if not in person. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then I'm just going to hand over to them. And it's the usual format. They will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, make their presentations, and then we'll go out to you and invite comments, your thoughts, your ideas, your contributions, or questions that you might have you want to put to the speakers. We'll take a few of those, and then we'll come back and hopefully go out a couple more times and build a conversation. So here we go. The first, I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to speak. And to my right is John Boughton. It is Boughton, amazing, because there's so many ways of pronouncing names. Boughton, yeah. And John is a social historian, and he's written two books, one of which is here. You might be familiar with this one, which he's very kindly leaving here at the Athenaeum, which is lovely, thank you so much. And it's called Municipal Dreams, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing. And he most recently has written another book, A History of Council Housing in 100 Estates, published by Reba. So that's John. He's an honorary senior research fellow at the School of Architecture of the University of Liverpool. And over the last 10 years, his blog, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Municipal Dreams, has provided a record and history of council housing across the country. Dr. Michael Owens, who isn't here but has sent us his presentation, is a London-based researcher, a writer and lecturer with a focus on urban development and the life of cities. And he teaches undergraduate programs for students from the University of California studying abroad in London. But he's also a board member of the Beaux-Arts Trust, which is one of the UK's largest artist studio providers, and he's worked on the Olympics as well. He worked with the former Mayor of London and played a senior role in planning and development there, including working on the 2012 London Olympics Games, the regeneration programme connected to that. And to my left is Ronnie Hughes, who is a very welcome return to the Liverpool Salon. And Ronnie is, I'm sure, known to many of you here, a walker, reader and writer of the Liverpool blog, A Sense of Place, which has currently been retitled and is out there under the name of 70. And he publishes his memoir of a life lived in and around the subject of how and where are people living, and is there any way I can help? And this way of thinking about living, this way of living has led him into a working life, mostly in Liverpool, of jobs in the City Council and social housing, followed by a self-employed second half of a career with community and social trading organisations. And he says that being a straightforward activist as and where the situation has seemed to require that. So we'll talk a bit more about that today. That's our speakers, and can I hand over now to John to start us off?
Thanks very much for the invite, Pauline. It's good to meet Ronnie again, and good to be in Liverpool. I'm not a local, as you can tell, but my wife's from Liverpool, so I hope that gives me some kind of local credit at least. And I'll be talking about some Liverpool schemes, amongst other things, in my kind of fairly brief presentation here. And again, I'm sure there are people that will know them much better than me and maybe even correct some pronunciations or whatever. But that can all come out in discussion, hopefully. So I'm going to talk really a sort of preface, I guess, what will be a sort of more contemporary discussion, contemporary leaning discussion at least, by looking at, basically looking at 45 and, you know, the years and early decades after 1945, which, as kind of Pauline alluded to, was in some respects, not you know, missteps notwithstanding, was in some respects a golden age of council housing, certainly in terms of the ambition and scale of construction. And the question is, why? You know, why did we, I think, you know, why did we manage that now and we seem incapable of doing so today? So I'll start straight away. And by looking at interwar planning, because of course, you know, 45 and the ideas and concepts and implementation after 45 didn't come from a vacuum. In some respects, it was both inspired and repelled, I guess, in a manner of speaking, by what was done and achieved in the interwar period. And it's appropriate, I think, to reference some Liverpool examples with which I'm sure you're familiar. So Norris Green, of course, Liverpool's largest kind of peripheral suburban estate, started in 26. You can see it photographed just before the First World War, by which time some over 7,500 homes, a population of around 37,000. So an example of, you know, what was achieved in the interwar period in terms of housing construction. Becontree in East London, 24,000 homes, a population of 118,000. So just some sort of mega schemes. But in some respects, of course, in terms of that scale, in terms of the kind of uniformity, these were all 2-3 bedroom family homes, almost without exception. You know, the planners and builders after 45 were seeking to provide a corrective to some of the kind of errors, if you will, of that kind of development. Speak is a really interesting example. When we think about post 45, we think about, amongst other things, the new towns, and we'll come back to that. But Liverpool was an early adopter in a sense. 1926 Liverpool Corporation Act allowed the council to develop industrial estates alongside or with actually housing schemes. And Speak, originating in 1928, was designed as a satellite town planned to accommodate all classes of the community. So in that sense, you know, a very sort of forward-looking and prescient scheme. Mostly post-war, but by 1939, around 1,600 homes completed, more or less on that plan. But obviously, a very bigger and larger and more diffuse animal emerges in the post-war period. And then finally, of course, Lancelot Kay. Now, I'm in Liverpool. I've always wondered how to pronounce his name, but I'm assuming it's Kay, not Key. Kay, good. So Lancelot Kay, of course, was a very one of the leading architects and planners of the day, city architect and director of architecture and housing in Liverpool. You know, the apartments, those Liverpool tenement blocks, which I think you'll be familiar with, most of them demolished now, of course, just the sort of bull ring element, student housing of St Andrew's Gardens remaining, but unusual. And of course, Kay was not unique, but very rare in promoting tenement living multi-storey accommodation as what he believed could be an A1 community in a properly planned township of flats. And Liverpool was exceptional in building a lot of flats. Around 1 in 5 of Liverpool council housing between the wars was tenement multi-storey accommodation. All well and good, lots of construction in the interwar period, but of course massive destruction as a result of war. Across Merseyside, 4,000 civilians killed, 10,000 homes destroyed. Bootle, 1 in 6 homes habitable after the war, only 1 in 6. So the statistics, the cost, the human cost, and of course the physical cost of war was enormous. Nationally in 1945, a government white paper policy document estimated that 750,000 new homes were required to replace those destroyed or damaged in the war. 750,000, this was the sort of the goal that was set. Around 500,000, an additional 500,000 were required to replace existing slums. Such was the scale of need, such was the scale of ambition in the post-war period. And so, you know, what I find fascinating and actually inspiring, without being too mythologizing or romanticizing about the war, is in fact the enormous drive to create, to imagine and then hopefully create a better Britain in the aftermath of wartime destruction and sacrifice. And you know, here you just see some pretty significant and typical examples of that. Some of you may be familiar with the Abram Games posters, the Army Bureau of Current Affairs. This was propaganda, using that term positively, disseminated to the armed forces. And it's interesting, you know, what was portrayed in the new Britain that would emerge literally from the ruins that you see, is this very modernistic Britain. You know, these are all actually real Impington College in Cambridge, the Finsbury Health Centre, Berthold Lebetkin, and Kensal House in East London, West London, both these by Maxwell Fry. So this was, you know, at least so far as Abram Games was concerned, this was the modern, forward-facing Britain that might emerge from wartime desolation. This is one of my favourite illustrations of all time, I think. City of London plan, a poster advertising a discussion around the City of London plan. So a bit like today, I guess, you know, some people sitting around discussing what they hoped might emerge in the future. In the theatre at 7:30. Now, the theatre in question was in Stalag Luft 3. This was a German prisoner of war camp. These were British army personnel discussing the future of Britain in a post-war period, hoping, of course, that Britain would emerge victorious. Stalag Luft 3 was the scene of the Great Escape, and while they weren't planning their Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3, they were planning the great escape of Britain from its benighted past. These things, of course, are well known further to the left. The Beveridge Report, published in 1943. This was on sale. You could buy it in your local branch of W.H. Smith's or wherever. Do you know how many copies were sold of the Beveridge Report? This dry, bureaucratic civil service tome. 630,000. Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? 630,000 copies of the Beveridge Report. People were queuing up to buy it. The National Health Service obviously also planned. So this was the kind of spirit that was animating a lot of discussion and politics and policy within the war. It's amazing, you know, in the midst of war, even, you know, well before victory could be assured, people were planning, you know, how to rebuild Plymouth, how to rebuild Coventry, and obviously how to rebuild, as we'll see, Liverpool and Merseyside. And that was seen equally, well, actually, yes, let's remember these also, in this kind of plethora of official documents, government documents, different organisations, committees tasked with sort of ideas and concepts of post-war construction. The Barlow report is was based on set up to investigate, you know, what to do with the distressed areas, the areas of mass unemployment of the 1930s and the Great Depression. Amongst other things, it recommends new towns along Garden City lines, so already by 1940. Burt report looking at methods of prefabrication to build quickly and at pace in the post-war period. Dudley report, design of dwellings, looking at what was built in the interwar period, looking to improve and modernise that in the post-war period, and that kind of drive carried on into the post-war era by those later official documents and that guidance that was provided. And equally, incredibly, I think, you know, well over 200 plans of post-war construction and modernisation devised for cities and towns and cities across the country. Just a few examples there. Plymouth, you can see County of London plan, Manchester, etc., etc. Thomas Sharp, who did the plan for Exeter, wrote 11 of them. Patrick Abercrombie, did 9 of them. And Thomas Sharp's book didn't quite have which was published in 1940, in the midst of war, 1940. So Thomas Sharp's book, Town Planning, 1940, didn't quite have the sales of Beveridge, but sold 250,000 copies. So again, you know, that notion of an ambition and desire to rebuild and build better, build back and build better. So the question is, I mean, it may seem, the question is how and why did this ambition, this kind of frenzy almost of post-war planning ideas and aspirations emerge? Well, I think, you know, to some degree, it's a reflection of what happened in the 1930s, because the slum clearance drive really begins in the 1930s and was stalled by the war, and then obviously made even more pressing necessary by the impact of war. It's worth reminding ourselves, I'm going to throw you some statistics out here, but just how squalid the majority of people's housing was. In 1948, a 1948 survey showed that 54% of British households lacked their own bathroom. 50% had no hot water. 7% had not even running water. So that was the scale of need. You know, half the population living effectively in slum housing. There was a survey in Liverpool in the mid-50s, 205,000 homes, 43% of the entire housing stock was found either unfit and unsuitable only for demolition. That was 26,000 homes. The rest of them requiring extensive repair, almost half the housing stock of the city. So the need was there, and obviously the intention, the ambition was to reward the sacrifice and effort of the wartime period. What beyond that, what was the kind of, if you will, the ideological drive behind it, other than sheer necessity? I think the war itself was significant. War was a progressive cause in this case. It was an anti-fascist struggle. For a brief time, the scientific socialism, even Stalin was our ally, and so there was socialism wasn't a dirty word in that context. And critically and crucially, of course, an enormous in this total war, an enormous machinery of state, which the Labour Party inherited as a majority government, and was at that time willing to use to full effect. Obviously, any future Labour government currently, if that is to be the case, will inherit a very different politics and state. And there's the local Liverpool examples. I won't read all this out, but you can see the scale of the local scale, Wallasey, Bootle and so on, that desire to rebuild and build better. And a quick shout out for the Liverpool School of Civic Design, 1909, set up in 1909, the first School of Civic Design in the world. And if you won't be able to read this, but an astonishing kind of roll call of names that were or became celebrated in their field. Abercrombie, Mawson, etc., etc. So Liverpool really plays a vital formative role, both in the interwar period, but obviously what emerges in that post-war period. So just to conclude my sort of talk, we'll look at sort of a couple of elements of what was happening locally in this era of post-war reconstruction, and we'll begin with Kirby. Which emerges as it's proposed as an industrial state into a period, but it's actually a post-war. It emerges post-war when the ordnance factory closes. Ronald Bradbury emerges, and it's planned from 1949 in that town plan as a new town in effect, not an official new town, not with a development corporation, and perhaps it is affected negatively by that. But from 1952 through to 1961, 10,000 homes built, incorporating the key planning ideas of the post-war era. What were those key planning ideas? We've kind of looked at the books and talked about it in sort of general terms. Obviously, firstly to build housing, that's straightforward in a sense, but how was that housing going to be better? How were the schemes and planning to be superior? One thing was, of course, neighbourhood units was the big post-war idea, a corrective of to Norris Green in a sense, the idea that you needed these kind of particular units, 6,000 to 8,000 people, full infrastructure, a bit like the 15-minute cities people talk about nowadays. But this notion that these neighbourhood units would provide a kind of human scale, livable community, and foster neighbourliness and community in a way that those larger amorphous estates didn't. So neighbourhood units was one. Mixed development was a second corrective to that overwhelmingly kind of family home focus of the interwar period. So council housing, catering for a range of people in a range of stages of life, not just families, but elderly people, couples, etc., etc. So mixed development. And the third one, it was sort of a separation of cars and people, typically Radburn, which was an idea imported from the US. We'll come back to that in a second. So here was Kirby, epitomising at least two of those concepts, the neighbourhood unit and mixed development, and proclaimed, of course, by Ronald Bradbury, and here it is, Show and Tell, the book itself, as a great achievement as it was understood and experienced at the point of his writing that in 1961. There's some illustration from the book. Bradbury described it as a thriving, well-established and thriving community in 1961. But it's not possible in print to convey the spirit of Kirby or the enthusiasm which has gone into its creation. There's been created in a remarkably short period a feeling of belonging and pride in the new Kirby. John Barron Mays, who was a Liverpool University sociologist writing in 1963, was a little less gushing and effusive. He described Kirby in this way: there are the usual long avenues of similar houses, some taller buildings and blocks, but little architectural elegance. An atmosphere of organised anonymity prevails throughout its length and breadth. A new, raw, hardly lived-in place, and softened by time and unrelieved by local colour. I'm not going to comment on Kirby. I mean, you will know it better. You know its checkered history, I guess, better than me. But if you can briefly just This is a cover from the Observer in 1979, which you perhaps can't see very well, but it's an article on Kirby published in 79 in the Observer magazine. The heading, the title was New Jerusalem Goes Wrong. So maybe that's something we can also think about when we take this discussion forward. And finally, let's go to Birkenhead, because Birkenhead provides one of the most kind of fascinating, colourful examples of post-war planning, well, wartime and post-war planning. The Woodchurch estate, which I hope most of you know, because it deserves to be well known, and I know Michael Owens, but I think we'll talk more about it. So it's, land was purchased in 26. The first plans were made in 1927. T.H. Mawson, one of those Liverpool University figures that I briefly referenced, and he planned a scheme that shall be of benefit to posterity, aesthetically, hygienically, practically in every way, the nicest and most tasteful of its kind in the kingdom. Sounds good, but nothing happened. Nothing happened at all from 27 when he made that plan into that wartime period. So we move on to the outline plan for the county borough of Birkenhead, which emerges within the war. Charles Riley, of emeritus professor of architecture at Liverpool University, was its author and the sort of planning consultant. And it's good, it's worth seeing it, because this is typical of the kind of planning that went into those volumes that you saw previously, existing land use, etc. And you won't see this, but these are the neighbourhood units that was kind of envisaged. Here's Woodchurch out to the west, isn't it? And here's some, again, you probably can't see it very well, but these are some sort of housing plans that Riley kind of promoted for post-war construction. Pretty sort of this kind of strange sort of honeycomb thing, but it's maybe obviously nothing like that happened, but maybe a seed of what we'll look at next. But Riley wasn't involved in the first plan. So the first plan is from 1944, borough engineer Bertie Robinson, and it's a pretty typical kind of garden suburb, if you will. Those sort of I mean, it looks good. It's got those kind of typical kind of curved streetscapes, lots of trees, open spaces, again with that notion of a neighbourhood unit. A garden city for the purpose of housing on the basis of a neighbourhood unit, as it was described by Robinson. Looks okay. Riley was pretty scornful. He admitted, quote, not liking very much the look of this layout, which was an ordinary garden suburb lines. I suggested to the borough engineer that we should make a new layout plan together. And I don't have time to go into that kind of relationship. Riley probably was pretty insufferable in some respects, but at least ambitious, but pretty scornful also of what he sort of saw as sort of municipal planning and construction. But the amazing thing about this kind of dispute between Riley and effectively between Riley and Robinson, becomes highly politicised. So Riley and that cause, which we'll see shortly, was taken up by the Labour Party, which was then in opposition in Birkenhead, and taken up far more widely, as we'll see. So here was Riley's plan, and Riley's plan was based around the village green. The motives of the scheme are the English village green and the small squares of the country town, where children can play and neighbours see one another and retain the friendliness of the little streets and slums. So there's sort of the neighbourhood unit on steroids in a sense, with this very, I would argue, this rather romantic view of both the village green and the slums. But this, this captured the imagination of the Labour Party, not only in Birkenhead, but more widely. And it was taken up indeed by Picture Post, which was then a very popular magazine. You can see here already, 1941, the New Britain must be planned. This is Maxwell Fry, who designed those buildings we saw earlier. But for our purposes, this amazing article in 1944, Planning Post-War Britain, the Example of Birkenhead. Here's poor old Bertie Robinson's plan, and here is the one that they were promoting, Riley's plan, the village greens that he was talking about. In the December 1944 Labour Party conference, Harold Lasky, who was the Labour Party secretary and a bit of a left-wing firebrand, said that for socialists the war each day was more fully an ideological war. The sacrifices it demanded can be justified in one way only. It will be justified by the degree in which the socialist commonwealth becomes the inheritance of the civilization we are seeking to reshape. And the Labour Party passed a resolution saying the community basis of town planning, as illustrated by Professor Sir Charles Riley's plan for the Woodchurch estate, Birkenhead, will best serve post-war housing needs. That's a story worth telling in its own right. It's one, I think, which just captures at least some of the kind of excitement and ambition around post-war construction. To kind of end it on a slightly flatter note, actually in the end neither of those plans was adopted. They adopted another plan from local architect Herbert Rouse, which, you know, again incorporates a lot of the kind of key ideas, planning ideas of both the interwar and post-war periods. Not a mere assemblage of houses. It is the architectural setting of a fully developed sociological conception of a community of people living within a defined neighbourhood. I won't read that full quote. So even this sort of toned down, maybe plan, which was concluded and acted upon eventually, was still kind of has that ambition to build. The rest of the story I will leave, I think, to Michael Owens. But I hope that's given you some idea of what we sought to achieve in 1945, what we hoped might be achieved. And I think hopefully it provides, you know, both an examination of what was achieved and what went unfulfilled and what went wrong, perhaps takes us to where we are in the present. Thank you.
Okay, third before, and what I want to do is tell you a story. It's a bit like the Woodchurch story, but not quite the same. Bit of analysis, and then some thoughts just of my own, but consciously to lead us in to a discussion of what we do about designing the future of how people live, where people live, what people live in and around Liverpool. So the story, let me immediately probably use this the wrong way. Nope, that's it. It's what I've just said. Great. The story is like a family myth. I'm calling it a myth because it's from 100 years ago it starts, but I want to take us through 100 years that's basically from the end of the Great War to today. My grandfather, I didn't realise this until I did this presentation. My grandfather, who I never met, was called Thomas Joseph Hughes. Yes, my granddad was T.J. Hughes, but not that one. He was taken prisoner, and this is the core of the family history really. He was taken prisoner in the last push of the Great War. He was poison gassed in the push, and then because he was taken prisoner, he was missing presumed dead when the peace was declared. And so when, to his commanding officer's surprise, he walked into the camp, they were still there in northern France in 1919. The key moment in the family's history happened because the commanding officer said, "We thought you were dead, Hughes. Are you all right?" Hughes said, "Yeah, I just want to get home," which anybody would say after 4 years in the trench and then being gassed and taken prisoner. However, that was taken as, yes, I'm all right. And so Thomas Joseph Hughes never got any compensation for his injuries or a pension from the army. And I've since found out that happened to thousands and hundreds of thousands of British soldiers after the First World War. Thanks, lads. Home's fit for heroes. you're not getting one. And so Thomas Joseph Hughes and his family, and there were 7 children, and his wife Mary, lived in, I think John's already used the word squalor. They lived in utter poverty and squalor, in rooming houses down by the docks. My dad once told me that they went through a winter in one of those without a side wall on the house. These were all private lets. They lived in what they could get. The family couldn't get a council house. There weren't that many of them around there at that time, but they couldn't get one. They weren't the deserving poor because Thomas Joseph wasn't working. He'd get very occasional night's work as a night watchman in the warehouses, but he just couldn't do physical work with his wrecked lungs. So they were poor. But it's a story of how we get to live in basically a new town. I don't know who took this picture, but this is my dad and his sister back in the 30s. They're somewhere down by the docks in those days. But their dad had a dream. He'd heard about Norris Green. And when the Liverpool Corporation started to take applications for going and living in Norris Green, Thomas Joseph and Mary were amongst the first to apply and the first to be knocked back because they weren't the deserving poor. There was still a bit of homes for the workers then going on. So they didn't get to Norris Green. Eventually they got the compensation prize of a walk-up flat. It was nearby. It was Owen House, which was a walk-up on the corner of Melrose Road and Stanley Road. The main thing that my dad told me of his memories were there were for, because they certainly weren't out of the danger which Norris Green represented. My dad would sit on the roof of Owen House, basically looking after the place during the war while he watched the docks being bombed. So, you know, it was probably one of the most dangerous areas of Europe to live in. So they dreamed. In 1954, the central event of the story happens, of course, because I'm born. And this, in a way, is, I've got a bit of a running theme of new towns and overspill estates. These photographs, well, there's my dad in the war again. He's an engineer in the RAF. He's holding me there, and we're in front of my nan's house, which is in Bootle, but in Orrell Park, which was Bootle's first overspill estate. Before they built the great big one out in Netherton, they built Orrell Park. And actually, the little Hughes family would live there too. That's my brother Colin, the one dressed in white who looks like a pixie in the second picture. And so we would live with my nans, but mostly we lived in, this is Diana Street. We had several, at least 2 houses, and I think it might have been 3, borrowed spaces living in the upstairs of houses still. So not much better than in the Thomas Joseph days, but still borrowed spaces. Diana Street is right in the middle, right in the shadow of Goodison Park. It's one of the little terrace streets that lead straight to Goodison Park. I thought the players all lived in there. So it was great. And I actually liked that, and I often, even when we moved out of it, I would often go back, because I think Diana Street particularly, living there, woke up my love for living in the city. And as you'll hear in about a minute, I moved back as quick as I could. But the determination in the family was always to move to our own Norris Green. And so my dad got work as a draftsman. My mum, like all the women on the Woodchurch estate, didn't work in those days. But we bought a house in Maghull, which was effectively a Liverpool new town. Never called that. It was called a new urban area. But it went from a little village of 3,000 of houses, and most of those around the railway station, to, in the time I lived there, a town of 30,000 people. I grew to loathe it. It was like living in the Truman Show, or Pleasantville. Do you remember them? You know, everyone did the same things at the same time. I've got a book over there, a fantastic survey that sociologists from Liverpool did in the 60s. People didn't go out. The population in Maghull went to the theatre once a year to a pantomime. And only 5% in the survey of teenagers thought the facilities in Maghull were any use at all. Well, I think they didn't ask any teenagers about that, because much like on the Woodchurch, there were loads of us. We had a great time growing up with our back gardens, the same picket fences as the Woodchurch. But once you were a teenager, you were stuffed. So it was dreadful. But the point is, while we were growing up, and we're actually in TJ's grotto there, me and my brother Colin, I think you can see the shining out of us. We've got a home. For the first time, we've got a home of our own with a back garden, somewhere to play, and more to the point, and I know this is a retrospective judgment about what we were thinking, we expected we would always have one. We had no reason to think having a home would ever become an issue again. So, First Communion, school photographs, all that stuff. And this is the place we grew up, how it had been until it became a new town. Foxhouse Lane in my days was full of post-war prefabs that had lasted well into the 1960s. In fact, I think they're brick-clad still there now. And the school shop is on the bottom picture. It was very, very oldie-worldy, perfect England. Nothing like Liverpool, but it was only 8 miles away. As I say, I loathed it. This isn't anyone I know, is Keith Jones. It's a bloke on the internet, but I think his picture perfectly sums Maghull up. It went into colour in the 60s, which is when colour was invented, as far as most people were concerned. And we had exactly that car. I think the cars came with the house. A dark blue Ford Cortina, except ours was called ELV 397C. That was Maghull. And everything was always getting better. I can remember thinking this until my 20s. Every year got better than the last. It was unbelievable. And in now, of course, I don't believe it. But I remember feeling it. So to my parents' rage and continuing mystification for the rest of their lives, I moved back to Liverpool. And actually got my first jobs up the hill at Everton, down across Scotland Road, working for the Liverpool Corporation in housing. And the whole other adventure begins there, really. I loved it. It was much more interesting. I was back in the city, and very early on, by pure luck, I found what would occupy me. I was going to say for the first half of my life, but it's probably why I'm standing here today with all of you listening to me. Until the housing disappeared. So same hill, slightly to the right, the photograph, but that was taken this summer. Where's it gone? Okay, well, I want to do a bit of analysis now. That was the story. This is the analysis of what happened. And for this, I'm going to go for a bit of objectivity to my friend who's here, Abby O'Connor, who's done a PhD, almost finished, of what has happened, of the housing position in Liverpool now, her analysis of it. I think it's the best economic, social and political analysis of Liverpool I've ever read, and I've read them all. So, Abby O'Connor, what's happened? What happened was, first of all, the well-known things. The 1979 election of Margaret Thatcher and the headlines for local authorities and housing that followed. The centralisation of former local authority powers, the right to buy, council stock transfers, the housing market, damn its memory, renewal initiative, all amounting, suggests Abby's research, via the route of stigmatising whole places as sink estates, plus the selling on of right to buy properties to private landlords, all that amounting to acts of new enclosure and the privatisation and financialisation of what has become a housing market, rather than what those two shining little boys lived in, where people live, as of right and expectation. So what we have now, and I'm going to go on to disagree with the idea that we just build and build and build, because what we have now is a housing market opened up to the neoliberal rent gap exploitation of, if you run it down, deliberately blight a place, enclose it, transfer it, do it up as little as necessary, call the flats in it lifestyle apartments, and bang their rents or prices up as high as you can dream them, and then a bit more, then people will still come, because people, different people from the poor people who lived there before, because of course they've been pushed out to anywhere they can get, then people will still come, because people have still got to live somewhere. Liverpool, though, really interestingly, Abby's work suggests, was always well up for and well ready for this, pretty much from the invention of Liverpool. Because Liverpool's population have always been of secondary importance to trade. The local authority here was invented to run and look after the docks. And then what we found was that, useful as the labour resources, we're the labour resources, useful as we might have been for the docks, as soon as the need for that diminished, we were moved to the outskirts, to the Kirby's, to the McGauls, to the Norris Greens, because that's where the work was then. We were moved to supply the work. So otherwise we were disposable. Our housing, therefore, has always been about resources and labour, prone to enclosure and dispossession, therefore, as necessary. So, and much of this, by the way, as emerges in Abby's work, has been done by the willing cooperation, use the word, willing cooperation of the local state, the local councillors. Whatever they say, they actually use phrases like the real world. And actually, they're as enthusiastic about imposing neoliberalism and monetisation on the city as any Tory. They will say Tory bastards as a performance to us. But actually, I don't believe them any longer after I've read Abby's work. So that's an analysis of where we're up to. So just some ideas to finish off with before we go on to all discussing it, because I think all discussing it is part of the answer. So I said I was going to disagree with this just building of houses, because what we'd be building them into now is a privatised, financialised, monetised market. It's never worked anyway, depending on the private market. Liverpool built the first council houses in this country in the late 19th century because the private landlords hadn't responded to Liverpool Council's call to build more houses to replace the kind of things that no doubt Thomas Joseph Hughes' dad was living in. They didn't do it. And now they've managed to get hold of the whole thing, turn it into a market and financialise it. Well, fat chance of most of us in this room getting a house out of that market. So I don't really go with just build the numbers. And I'm not hearing anything except just build the numbers from the major parties at the moment. A national housing service I've seen mentioned in the press within the last few days if you like, to remake the link between the NHS and housing that was personified by Nye Bevan, who was the minister for both in 1947. So I'm more attracted to that idea, but I'm not attracted to the national bit. I think we've seen enough centralisation. And also, as probably a lot of you will know, I spent quite a lot of my last 10, 15 years working in community-led. National housing is a very long way from community-led. So, but we need to think about it, because the bit of national housing that I like is, and the linking it to health, is cradle to grave. Like the little boys in the picture, I want the next generation, their children, to know they will always be able to have a house and always have a choice. Choice, though, brings me to context. Things have changed in that there are aspects, and I call this the Primark Amazon syndrome. There are aspects of neoliberalism that people like and people will be reluctant to let go of. I think I would. The speed of service, Sarah and I, my wife Sarah's over there as well, often think there's a little shelf halfway up the M62 with what we were thinking of buying already on it. Because before you know it, there's a grey Amazon van outside the door and here's your whatever you've just thought of has turned up. People quite like that. And so I think some elements of choice, because I worked in the city, I remember people coming in tears saying, I've been on this waiting list for 27 years, where's my house? You know, some elements of choice and speed are going to have to be built in. So, oh yeah, I've got slides, haven't I? I've got a suggestion. Following on from everything was always getting better. Thanks to Abby. Maybe we could organise hope. We've done it twice, as we've heard, particularly from John. We've done it twice in the last century. With a war going on, we did all that planning. We had the Beveridge report, which I think was in 42. We had soldiers reading it in their 630,000, actually while they were at war. We had Rab Butler, so that was a Liberals report. We had Rab Butler's Tory Education Act. Then we had the 45 Labour government. We had the NHS. We had the housing boom. We organised hope. We organised the hope that eventually resulted in me and Colin and my family moving into a new town on the outskirts, the first time the family had ever had a home of their own. And then before that, and then to run alongside of it, we'd organised hope again. We'd had the model villages becoming the garden cities, becoming the whole idea of town planning, as John illustrated, which had then led into estates like Woodchurch, estates like Norris Green and Kirby and McGull. So we'd done all of that again, so growing up there. Maybe we could do it again. And I think that some of the thinking about what we could do now looks back at some of them and thinks we could just do it again. But I think that time and context changes and you can't use the same magic tricks you always used last time and think you'll get away with it. But I think there is mileage in a mix of some of those things. I like the idea of council housing again, but not to completely rely on it. I really like the idea of garden cities and think that was very, very underexplored. And I love the idea of homes for life. Home is a human right. Definitely, I love those things. But just really, really final thoughts. I think because the times have changed, we need some other new thoughts really in there as well. And I don't know what they are, because I think I want us to be able to create them with the kind of openness and 650,000 copies bought that we were managing the last time around when we did Magic Things. What I wanted to mainly say today is we are capable of that. It's not hopeless. I mean, we think now we've got a housing crisis, which, like George Orwell's war, seems to be not so much a crisis as a state of being. Out there on Church Street today, we've got the usual homeless being much boosted up in their numbers by the refugee homeless who have to find new homes now in 7 days. You know, so we've got all that crisis going on. We've clearly got a climate crisis, we've got an economic crisis, we've got a political crisis. But none of them are the Second World War. I think we can do it. But I think somewhere in the line of it, I would like to institute a principle of hope. Like we actually build that in, that we are always getting better. And the hope principle is a bit like the the principle of human rights, and also a bit like the doctor's Hippocratic Oath, that new ideas must be shown to do no harm, and then we move on. We won't get everything right. Of course we won't, we're human beings. But I think we can organise hope, and that's my wish for us all.
Thanks very much, Louis.